Before I introduce you to our archives project and the symposium, I'd first like to thank our funders at the LUCE Foundation, and particularly Sean Buffington, who made this project possible. And we're also honored today to be supported by our provost, Tony Liss. I don't think he's come on yet, but and also our Dean of Humanities and the Arts, Renata Miller, who will now make opening remarks. Renata?
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to welcome you to this afternoon's program, and I want to thank Michelle and her team for creating Archives as Muse and the LUCE Foundation for their support of our work here at City College. And I want to thank our distinguished panelists for being a part of this project and for being a part of this event today. Archives as Muse has grown out of our exceptionally strong creative writing program at City College. And I should again note that Michelle is the director of our MFA program. And our creative writing program has always been committed to helping students find their voice and to helping students make their voices heard through writing. Archives as Muse is also part of a cluster of archival initiatives that the Division of Humanities and Arts is currently undertaking. Archives are at the heart of our humanistic mission. How we understand ourselves and our collective histories depends on the things that we preserve and how we value and organize them. Notably, we know all too well how the histories of people of color have been erased and distorted in the United States. And so as humanists, we study history, but we are also training our students to write history. And our distinguished colleague, Linda Villarosa, and her work with the 1619 Project provides great inspiration for us in this regard. And we are also training our students to be stewards of our cities and our nation's archives and collections, without which certain histories could not and would not be told. In Humanities and Arts, we have a great collaboration with the library. And so William Gibbons, one of our panelists today, and one of our key people working on the Archives as Muse project, has been a great partner in building our archiving programs in Humanities and Arts. Some examples of how we're training students to work with archives include our development of digital humanities courses and our wonderful partnership with the Rockefeller Archive Center. And we're currently in the process of hiring 2 new faculty members in Black Studies who will be partnering with the Schomburg Center and the Hispanic Society to offer experiential learning opportunities for our students at those sites. So if this is your first time coming to an event at City College and learning about the work that we do, welcome. I hope it won't be your last, and I hope that you will follow the various different things that we do, particularly in our archiving initiatives, and keep track of them, and that we'll see you at future events. Thank you, and enjoy today's program.
Thank you so much, Dean Miller. Archives as Muse, a Harlem Storytelling Project, is an idea, a project, a website, and a conversation to mobilize creatives, including writers, storytellers, artists, and others to use the archives. The project reflects the MFA and City College's commitment to connect with, serve, understand, and celebrate the Harlem community while enhancing the community's own tools for memory, research, and creativity. We, as an MFA program in creative writing, recognize that we are located at the site of the Harlem Renaissance, the literary, social, and cultural explosion of creative and intellectual work by Black artists, poets, novelists, philosophers, activists, and musicians in the 1920s. We want to dive into that rich literary history and acknowledge our link to it. We also want to recognize the original peoples who lived in Manhattan, the home of the Lenape tribe. We created a 3-year project that will includes graduate and undergraduate archives courses, symposia, interviews, online workshops, and exhibitions, as well as a resource section that will include links to other public archives. We collaborate with our own Cohen Library archives at City College, as well as many local and national archives, such as the Schomburg Center, the Langston Hughes Archives, and the Hurston Wright Archives. We are not an archives ourselves, but a tool and a resource for students, storytellers, community activists, and archives. And we bring them the capacity to begin a dialogue. this is what we hope we do. So thank you. I wanted to first thank very much our team, Sydney Valero and Anna Mrjanovic, who work very closely with me and are the experts in setting up all things digital and all things artistic to highlight this project. And also I want to thank Professor Liz Mazzola, who's in the audience. She helped us write the grant. Her enthusiasm, her encouragement, her courage was incredible, and we owe Liz a huge thanks. So welcome to this particular symposium, How Creatives Use the Archives. Before I introduce our moderator, I'd like to say that we do anticipate going over an hour, but to honor our program, we'll stop at the hour so that those who need to leave can do that. We'll probably begin at that point at around 6:05 or 6:10 to take questions from the audience, and you can put your questions in the chat and Sydney will ask them, or you can raise the digital hand. So right now I will turn this over to our extraordinary moderator, Nelly Rosario. Nelly Rosario is an extraordinary creative thinker, novelist, professor at Williams College, and an archivist who has taught 2 classes in the archives program in our MFA program. We're very grateful for her presence and agreeing to moderate this exciting panel. Nelly, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the Archives as Muse project. I could not say no to the invitation to come and teach at City College, a place that I hold very dear to my heart, and a place that I think in many ways, does hold the stories of New York City and has a responsibility to disseminate those stories in the community. And so for me, I think the best people to do that are creatives. I'm very honored too, because there are 3 figures here, Herb Boyd and William Gibbons and Lewis Watts. I mean, like I said, they're just titans, and it's so exciting to have this conversation. And I keep going back to I go back to childhood all the time, because I think that's sort of the Newman of creativity. And one of the stories that most captured and captivated me as a child was Noah's Ark, right? Because that to me was the earliest archival story. I teach it. I think we have some students here from the Langston Hughes and Hurston Wright course. We start there. It's biblical, right? Thinking about how to sort of taxonomize, think about collecting, think about preserving and valuing, right, the world's creations, valuing history. I came to archives. I was shocked that I heard my name I was called an archivist. I've never studied archives, but I did come to archives as a writer. Having been born in the Dominican Republic and listening to stories that my parents told me about the dictatorship, I spent a lot of time looking at the Library of Congress archives, looking at these images that, of US soldiers during, the 1916 occupation, and not looking at the soldiers, but at the little Black barefoot girls who were like hanging around nearby and wondering what their stories were. So what I was trying to rescue from those archives were the voices that were in shadows, that were silenced, that were in the background. So photographs really helped me write my first novel, Song of the Water Saints. And I really urge writers to just keep going into archives and really mining them for stories. And in fact, Lewis Watts's virtual exhibit with, mining the archives is really, it's really that. It's like, what kind of gold and gems can we find in many of these archives that often when you look at the metadata, you're not going to see other stories, right? You're not going to see the full picture. So today, I think what I really want to do is I want to sort of engage, I was going to start out with a joke, a journalist, a librarian, and a photographer walk into an archive, right? What happens? Our journalist here is Herb Boyd, a prolific author and educator. I always say taxonomized as a prolific author and educator, right? Because, we're sort of taxonomized in these roles on the kind of knowledges we produce. But I feel that we have many more knowledges that don't always fall in these different categories. So I think Herb Boyd is beyond a prolific author, beyond an educator. He's written or edited over 20 books and published countless articles for national magazines and newspapers, including New York's Amsterdam Muse, which is New York City's oldest Black newspaper, as you all know. Our librarian, William Gibbons, is taxonomized as a chief of user services and associate professor at City College. And I believe, after my conversations with William, that he is a secret novelist. And then our photographer is Lewis Watts, Professor Emeritus of Art at the University of California, Santa Cruz, whose virtual exhibition, as I mentioned, Mining the Archive, can be found on the Archives as Muse site. So one of the things I kept thinking about this panel, things come to me always in images. And I kept thinking, going back to this Greek myth of Prometheus, the Titan god of fire who defies the gods by stealing fire from them and giving it to humanity in the form of knowledge. He's often known as being sort of, this intellectual figure, a creator, a champion of humankind, the author of human arts and sciences. But I was always kind of struck by the story of this figure stealing fire and giving it to humans, and then gets punished for it, right, by Zeus, who punishes him by tying him to a rock, and then an eagle eats his liver, which regenerates, and then he's sort of like stuck in this curse of this perpetual punishment. And it makes me always think about what are our roles, right, as knowledge bringers, as people who rescue stories that aren't told, who bring the fire, right? What are our responsibilities? And I think that's a responsibility we don't always think about as creatives. We think we're just writing stories, or we're not aware of what knowledges we're always bringing. And maybe even our responsibilities to bring knowledges that are buried, that are hidden. I love the idea that Prometheus, the word itself, I think some people speculate it means forethought. So I was thinking a lot about, all of your bios, and there's a lot of work in the past. So I'm really thinking, I want to sort of do some forth thinking in this session today, and getting us to maybe think aspirationally about archives. But maybe contextualize within this idea of radical empathy in the archives, which is coined by archival scholars Michelle Caswell and Marika Seafor. They wrote a 2016 paper titled "From Human Rights to Feminist Ethics, Radical Empathy in the Archives." And it was published in Archivaria, which I think by the Association of Canadian Archivists. It's it's sort of a foundational text that I use in the archival courses I teach. Because what it does, it sort of asks us to imagine archives. We often imagine archives as like the actual records, or we think of the archivist, right? Oh, that was me, Jesus. Of course, they start calling right now, but anyway. So I think we always think of the archivist or the actual records. But one of the things this article sort of challenges to think about are the different and shifting effective roles involved involved with archives, which is the archivists themselves, right? The records creators, the records subjects, the records users, and the larger communities. So what the article really challenges to think about is, how might creatives deploy a radical empathy approach that takes into account these diverse effective roles and responsibilities? So when we're engaging archives, it's very interesting how creatives sort of shift in their roles around archives, right? Either as creators, as users. How do we engage the community? What are we doing with the subject, right? How are we having empathy for all these different roles? So what I wanted to do today, and I sort of want to address Herb Boyd, who is our sort of honorary figure here. You've done so much incredible work. There's so much publication, and I'm sure there's all these sort of projects that you'd love to work on. I would like to ask, what is your dream archive? I've just gotten $1 million. I don't know from where, but you have over $1 million to work with. I'm giving you, let's talk about this dream archival project. There are no barriers. What stories would you want to rescue? And I know that you just donated, an amazing archive to William Gibbons and the City College. And I'm sure that's a story in itself, but I'm wondering, what is your sort of imagined possible potential archive you would love to work on, given infinite time and funds?
Well, thank you very much, Nelly. The first thing I would do would hire you. You would be my archivist.
I'll wear gloves. I promise I'll wear gloves and a face mask.
Hey, William, you heard her. William, you heard her, okay?
I behave in the archives.
Michelle, we got her, right? Yeah, we don't have the $1 million, but we've got the work to be done there. And you've taught me this taxonomize. Okay, I like that. I think I'll keep it. I'll keep it. That's wonderful. No, the whole notion of archiving is both like a personal and collective, private and public. You can talk about the esteemed and noted locations. You already cited one in terms of the Library of Congress. And then you can work your way down locally. So much of it depends on the subject, topic, individual, organization, institution that you're researching. Like you suggested, I've been at the Amsterdam News for more than a generation now. And I'm sitting on top of an archive right there. Extraordinary collection that it hasn't been organized. It hasn't been cataloged. Haven't gone through there to separate it and make it available for researchers and scholars. That's one of the dreams I would have, is to make sure that it's more accessible. You can go online, of course, and that's another interesting aspect of the whole technology and how it provides. I mean, people can go online and they can start with a Google and go forever, and keep following links and go deeper, deep dives into your subject matter. So the generation that's coming behind us, and the technology expands and improves all the time, they have some advantages that we didn't have, particularly in terms of location. How can you get to a particular, very special collection, and it's so far away and hasn't been digitized. So we had that kind of disadvantage, you might say, coming along in previous generations. Now it's more and more accessible, but even in that accessibility, there's a certain kind of refining that has to be done, and careful approaches, and understanding exactly what are you trying to do, what are you seeking. Some of those things are very intimidating, Nelly, as you know, going and trying to go to some of those major archives, and it can be very intimidating. You don't know exactly who do you talk to, trying to express a certain kind of insecurity that you have. And you shouldn't have that fear. You should be able to ask a librarian, ask an archivist, and tell them exactly what you need, because that is a part of the first process. It's just owning up to the fact that you do not know, and you should not be terrified in asking a librarian. I remember several years ago, William, when I approached you, and you have been so indispensably helpful for me over the years, because we can start right there at City College. And I've gone through the Cohen collection. I mean, it's a tremendous collection we have right at universities. Students should know that. And then they shouldn't be, ignoring, avoiding the libraries that exist within easy reach. I spent half my life in various institutions, including Wayne State University in Detroit, where my whole educational thing. I guess parts of you understand that very well coming out of Detroit. And it's good to see that I have at least one Detroiter has joined us here. Barbara Bearfield is with us, and I worked with her. And perhaps later on we could talk about some of the endeavors that I've had and the resources that we've used to put together a collection, Jazz Space Detroit. I worked with her, and she has a new edition of that out. But I mean, these are projects that are going and individuals that I've approached, and they lead you in different directions. For example, in Detroit, if you're doing anything on labor, there is the Walter Reuther. That's the collection there. Absolutely phenomenal. Here in New York City, the Tenement, if you're doing anything on radical or leftist or communist and the whole activist period, go to the Tenement. That's at NYU. So some of these institutes like William Spingarn, going to Howard University. Of course, the Schomburg, we got the Schomburg here, and I've used that almost ad infinitum. I mean, I've worn those librarians out going to get the books, and they have collections there that they're still trying to really catalog. These people turn their collections in books and books, as I've done at City College, but they got to be organized, they got to be cataloged, they got to be laminated. These collections have to be preserved, and before it's made available to the public. So Nelly, what I'm saying is that with that $1 million, we can begin to, first of all, go through my own collection and get that together, because we got a lot of work to do there. And that's a collection that goes over a generation of books. And even before that, I had another at least 20 years of collecting of materials, and of course my own writings. That's going to be a part of that. So that $1 million, we may need another million just to get it over the hump. But Nelly, you understand exactly what I'm saying, and this is a very daunting. It can be very daunting, doing a research, and you have to start off. These days, you can just start off with the internet, and then you can move from there into different. They'll lead you to where you need to go in order to get to those very valuable primary sources. Because you want to get to the primary sources, secondary, tertiary, that's okay. But can you get to the primary source for that particular topic, subject, individual, organization, or institution? So that would be my advice for the young aspiring scholars out there who need to, get that dissertation finished or get that first book published. You can start right there. Start right at home. Sometimes you can just go through. Some of us are blessed to have parents and family members, extended family members who have collections. Those are what you call unofficial archives that's in these attics and basements. Go through those, because there's a lot of information of value there. I've discovered, in doing the whole history of the Nation of Islam, for example, that a family had in its attic, all of this stuff to do with Bernstein Sharif Muhammad, who was the woman who was pretty much a key mover and shaker. She had that background, William. She went to Commerce High School, and they taught the secretarial, that kind of work that was necessary that she brought to the Nation of Islam, and working with, Wali Muhammad and working with Elijah Muhammad to start the Nation of Islam. In her attic, all of that material that her sons and daughters had, and it's still waiting to be cataloged, still waiting to have some scholar and researcher go through and work with the family and maybe develop some kind of a book that's based upon her life. And of course, her life was extraordinary, and the need to be wider known, given a little bit more recognition for the kind of tireless dedication that she gave to the founding of the Nation of Islam. Let me stop right there, Nelly, and maybe we can bring Lewis and William and bring Michelle back into this discussion.
Well, there's a wink, hint, hint, there's a potential project there for Archives as Muse, hopefully. $1 million is a lot to me, so maybe I need to but I kind of want to pop over to William Gibbons, i.e. Prometheus. How would you bring the fire of the Amsterdam Muse archive that is already finished? We have finished the project, right? How will you bring that fire to humans, right? How do we, I think you mentioned a book, Herb, but I'm wondering, you know, how can archives live in ways that the fire reaches everyone or reaches maybe people who may not be your typical user, right? Or imagine themselves as having access. How can we sort of activate this information in a way that maybe draws people who may have never been interested in the subject matter? And that's the sort of, and I think we'll talk to, you know, Lewis in a second, because Lewis does the beautiful work. I mean, it's just amazing, gorgeous ways in which archives are photographed and engaged. But I want to hear from the librarian, sort of what would be a strategy to bring the fire.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor, and I appreciate very much being here with all of you. So the $1 million is fantastic. $2 million is fantastic.
Let's say two. Let's just say two for now, and then move on.
But what's key, what's really key, and essential for the Amsterdam News Archive, the Herb Boyd Archive, the Dr. John Henry Clark Archives, is space. Is space. That is the key thing. What is happening now is an explosion of collections that are falling upon and in jeopardy of, as Professor Boyd said, of getting lost in attics and basements and floods forever, because people we are not able to connect people and having the space and the capacity to receive these collections. What is happening now is the baby boom generation is now, with all of this material, where does it go? And many institutions don't have the capacity, the space to house it. With those types of funds, we can then reimagine and repurpose spaces in libraries and archives. We need to value our archival collections, our archives, and invest more and think about repurposing those spaces. We also need staffing. As Professor Boyd mentioned, the expertise that is there today, that, you know, we have to train a generation of digital scholars, digital humanists, and begin to collect, preserve, make accessible these collections. And so the whole production of archiving the memorabilia and collections of post and pre-Great Migration, as well as baby boom generation, is to have the space to house the staff, to house the collections, and be able to efficiently process these collections. I'm excited to be able to work with Professor Boyd and James Dreyer with the Clark books, and you know, it's going to be an enormous task to repurpose and reimagine spaces in the Cohen Library or in other libraries, perhaps, to store and house and create reading rooms and memorial collections. So you know, my vision is to reimagine and to repurpose. And City College would love to have the Amsterdam News archival collection. City College is the place for that. City College is in Harlem. Amsterdam News is Harlem. And it is an appropriate place for that collection.
I think, William, what you're saying, I love the word repurpose, because I think, and reimagine, repurpose and reimagine. There's not a lot of real estate in New York, right, in terms of space. I would envision an Amsterdam Muse collection. I would want to have a conversation with Black architects and engineers. How can they reimagine presenting such, right, a collection that maximizes space or reimagines space or rebuilds space, right, in a way that incorporates the archive so that people can actually walk through the archive or experience the archive in an embodied way. So here's where I'm curious, Lewis Watts, how would you imagine, what would you, I'm curious what your camera eye would do, what your lens would do with this kind of archive collection that Herb has put together with a mere $2 million in the company of William Gibbons at City College.
Well, first thing I was going to say is, besides things like all of the Black press, a lot of which has not been organized, which I think is really important, in the mention about archives or photo albums in people's basements, there's a place in Berkeley called Urban Ore, and I haven't been there recently, but they have a kind of section of salvaged photographs. And when a lot, especially older people die, in many cases, the work just gets thrown out on the street. And those histories are incredible. I mean, they really are. It's funny that I did a book called Harlem of the West about the Fillmore District in San Francisco. And that archive was saved because a barber across the street from where the archive was, barber shops, mortuaries, beauty parlors are the visual archivists in the Black community. And
Yes.
he knew there was valuable that was about to be thrown out and saved it. And that happens all the time. So I think that those sources need to be, if you excuse the expression, mined, absolutely. And I think the sort of optimistic things happening is, at least in the art world, all of a sudden, some of the people making decisions about what shows in museums and other institutions, that group is becoming more diversified. And I think things happening, I think that's one of the things that CCNY can do, is make sure the people making those decisions are people with this certain consciousness. I mean, I think that's really important. I would say my Harlem story is when I was 8 years old, we were visiting an aunt in Harlem, and I said to my mother, I said, "Do we ever live here? This seems very familiar to me." And she said to me, "Not in this life." And I have to say that I've always felt as if I'm at home, and I've been there before in another life when I'm in Harlem. I got access to Langston Hughes' brownstone a couple of times, and I always go there when I go to Harlem. So I would say the act of making photographs on some level is an archiving gesture to, that's what we do. And I sort of found a cache of photographs at the Amistad Center for Art and Culture in Hartford. And at the top of the book was an original version, a Frederick Douglass book with one of his incredible pictures on the cover. And as soon as I saw that on the other book, I knew what I wanted to do, that I knew I wanted to scan them and kind of recontextualize and reintroduce them as another way to kind of either make books that are maybe too fragile to people's hands, but to kind of get an example of it in other venues, either online or in, and I think there's a variety of ways that work can be sort of put out to the public, because I think that's what's really important, is people need to know their history. I think that's what the 1619 project and the fact that exists is all of a sudden making these histories that have been either close to being erased or certainly were not on the surface, to bring them to the surface. And I think that's really important. I think that it has to do with the money is really important, and then who does the money go to in terms of making these stories accessible and articulated in a way that the truth comes out, if that makes sense.
Thank you for that. That's really, really important to sort of see all these different examples of the ways in which we can sort of reimagine. I didn't think about, as we're talking, these sort of public spaces that where we frequent that are not always museums. I've seen a lot of archival photographs, particularly in Harlem, in restaurants, right, in ways that it really like bring you, it's almost like it's a sensual experience of the archive where you're eating, your all your senses are activated, and you're not just in some library looking through them without a real history, an embodied history. I sort of want to ask her, I mean, I know that, you know, this is sort of just exactly a week ago, we lost Malika Shabazz, you know, just 2 days after the 2 men convicted of killing Malcolm X were exonerated. And I'm curious, what is that, what kind of new urgency does that bring to the work you've done? Maybe talk to us a little bit about the work you did working on the Malcolm X diaries, and sort of, because I mean, I don't think archives and going through them and even trying to rescue them, it really is a sort of full soul and body work, right? It's not a distance clinical scholarship where, I mean, there's so much there involved. So I thought maybe I'd love to hear some of your, I'm sure it sounds like a crazy adventure from my conversations with Michelle, and I, maybe if you can share some of that experience with us.
But one of the things about dealing with an iconic individual like Malcolm X is that there are just so many different avenues of expression and research connected and related to his experiences, because he was such a, I mean, he's a multifaceted individual. I mean, people see him primarily as this here militant, radical activist, Black nationalist, what have you, but he was a historian, educator, he's a teacher in the highest sense of the word. And some of my first lessons, and as a result of my involvement in the whole educational arena, comes as a result of his influence on me. The exoneration here, of course, not a month, certainly it may be an exaggeration there, but hardly a period of time goes by that some element, some aspect of his life is not headlines news. I was just thinking, for example, about the whole Netflix thing that I was a part of. Who killed Malcolm X? Well, that continues to resonate. I mean, people still trying to get their arms around that one, like who were the actual assassins and what happened to them? And of course, it's back in the news again when you have 2 of them being exonerated. And all along, many of us in the historical community and Malcolmites felt that it was just an insufficient case. The case was just so full of holes. And I teach a course at City College each spring for the last 15 years on the life and legacy of Malcolm X. And what I did, Nelly, last semester is we took a deep dive into the trial transcript. That's 4,000 pages. I took my 35 students and divvied up the transcript. Each of them take a couple hundred pages. Ideally, I had in mind is that let's go ahead and review this here transcript that had never been put out there in public before. My dream is to assemble all of their reviews of the 100 pages or so that they were assigned. And then I would stitch it all together, write a preface, a review, and maybe, hey, well, I'll go approach one of the small publishers and maybe we can talk about the trial and, as a historical record. Well, that's the great ideal was not realized because, first of all, when you go into something like that, you're talking about students who are not really prepared for that kind of research. Even on a graduate level, it leaves a lot to be desired. But nonetheless, they struggled through it. They did very well as far as I'm concerned, and they were graded on that particular capacity. Most of them did very well in that sense. But in terms of publication, well, it's a lot more work to be done because you got 35 students, only 25 of those students really finished their projects. So I was able to look at what they had done and review the section of the trial that they had. So what I'm going to do with this coming semester, we'll pick it up again, and what was left over from the last year, I'll reassign it now and divvy up the remaining sections of the transcript to the incoming students. Now that I have this background in preparation, I understand exactly how to do it. Some of the shortcomings that I didn't have in mind previously. Now I know exactly how to do it, how to assign, how much to assign, what to look for, and how to prepare them for examining the particular section of the transcript that they have. The transcript reveals so much. It's more than just a transcript. It's a lot of history there, and the testimonies coming. You can see like the role of the prosecution, how the defense attorneys, and even the kind of discrepancies between from one witness to another. Even the people, the defendants themselves. And one of the main defendants who confessed to the crime, he did his best to exonerate the other two. That pops up again and again. They're stepping away from the Nation of Islam. And there's some other kind of dynamics that are going on in terms of people. When did they join the Nation of Islam? The whole Organization of African American Unity, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, who in fact was a Sunni Muslim within that. So it's contextualized in such a way that it draws and brings out a lot, the full dimension of Malcolm's life, right down to the work that I did with his one of his daughters, Ilyasa, in terms of the diary. And of course, that's a whole nother story there in terms of the archival research and going into the Schomburg and the whole history of how that material ended up at the Schomburg. That in itself is a saga. That's a tale to be told.
I am really just, I mean, I think it's a beautiful way in which you take an archival, you know, record like that. And I mean, you could have turned it over to, you know, professionals or, you know, but this idea of the process itself is almost more important than the findings, right? In some ways.
That's important. That's a good point, Nelly.
And that you're bringing, I mean, going back to this idea of the fire, I mean, really like whatever the students have produced, just hearing your story and hearing what the process, I wish I would have been a fly on the wall in these classroom discussions. And it's really bringing history, right, to people's reality, right? I think we can read it in a textbook, but actually going through these transcripts and doing the interpretive work, right, requires you to go out and look for more information and really try to understand the larger context. Thank you for that. I'm always very curious. So I'm curious for William and for Lewis, like, how do you teach thinker? And I think, I'm assuming this is, what kind of students were these, Herb? They were graduate students in?
No, these are undergraduates.
Undergraduates?
Oh, yeah.
In what school?
Just right here at City College.
But were they specific majors?
Well, we met, right here at City College, but we did it all virtual last semester, obviously. Right. But this semester, it's going to be a combination. I'm not sure. William and I are going to have to work that out, how we're going to handle this semester coming up, whether it be completely virtual, in person, or a combination thereof. I'm hoping it's more in person, William.
Were they specific majors to students or?
Exactly, right there. We know I've taught there in the classrooms for 15 years. You know, I would love to get them back in the classroom and be in person with them. I think it works a lot better because in terms of presenting other kind of materials, you know, the film stuff. I did some film stuff with them, but after a while you do an introduction to Malcolm's life, and then you can go in so many different directions. I mean, goodness, in terms of music, in terms of style, politics, wherever
there's
way you want to go, it's all there. It's
multiple
all there.
Curricula in the transcripts.
Yes, exactly.
So William and Lewis, I'm curious, how do you sort of activate the archives in the classroom? Because I think that's another space that is really important in how we share this information.
Yeah, so I was fortunate that Liz Mazzola and Michelle had come to me and asked me would I teach and develop a course on archiving and its value and its importance. And so I said, well, what's this course? What do you want this course to look like? And they pretty much gave me a blank slate. So I needed a title for the course. And I asked Michael Henry Adams, I asked Herb Boyd, I asked Linda Villarosa. And Linda says, why don't you entitle the course The Evidence of Things Unseen? And the inspiration for the title came from James Baldwin's book essay, The Evidence of Things Not Seen. It was Baldwin's commentary on the Atlanta child murders in the late 70s and 80s and the conviction of Wayne Williams. And convicted of 2 of the 28 murders. And what Baldwin discovered was there was evidence that was not seen that perhaps would have not put him at all 28 of the tragedies. So as my colleague Lewis talks about mining and excavating the archives, it's the evidence of things unseen in archives that need to be mined. And so the course was a research seminar. It was hands-on, and it was working with creative writers and intellectuals to mine the CCNY archives and the Schomburg Center. And it was a collaborative partnership between the MFA Creative Writing Program, the English department, the Schomburg Center, and City College Libraries and Archives and Special Collections. And so if you think about the things that are unseen, and if you think about what if Malcolm's diary was auctioned off and we never learned about his travels in Mecca through the diary, or when you talk about collections being lost, destroyed, fragmented, like Medgar Evers' papers when he passed away, accidentally tossed in the garbage. And that history, that moment of the investigations of these lynchings in Mississippi were just totally lost, devastating. And then, I'm just blown away that Dr. John Henry Clarke's book collection is intact. And we're just so thankful for James Dry, who had maintained a collection in storage for over 20 some years, which easily to find a home, which easily could have been scattered around. So having these collections intact is really important. So what I do with the students is have them learn how to be knowledgeable library users and archivists to utilize archives to their fullest potential, to be lifelong learners, to be confident, efficient researchers who have the ability to think critically, be able to evaluate, synthesize, and interpret and evaluate information. And those are really, really important skills. As Herb is talking about, is giving students these kinds of materials and being able to interpret them. That is a skill within itself,
I'm sorry.
And then the last point is the intimidation of people utilizing and walking into a sacred place like the Schomburg Center and being overwhelmed and being intimidated. So the course breaks down that barrier. The course helps and trains students to be able to go in there and have a focus and be able to navigate the collections and interact with the librarians and the archives.
It makes me always, I keep thinking about Wakanda. I do work for the MIT Black History Project, and we had the name of the first Black woman, I think class of 1909. No one had ever seen her. All along, her whole family's archive was across the bridge at Boston University. It was just a matter of entering a few keywords, doing a little bit of footwork, and then just getting this photograph of this woman who, with her brother, they were both there at the time. I think she kind of like had tuberculosis, so you have her transcript, but we never had an image of her. And just seeing that image, I remember I was sort of sitting there crying, wearing gloves and crying. And I'm like trying not to wipe my eyes with the gloves. But this idea of like it's like there is a hidden treasure right in front of us, right? And having the foresight. And a lot of times the foresight is really the eye of a child, where you're asking basic questions. You're using basic keywords. I love the thesaurus, so I'll sort of keep inverting the keyword in different ways, because you never know who the person who was writing. I go back to taxonomy all the time. Who was coming up with the way to key in this particular record? We're assuming they use X words. Well, can we keep trying other words that, you know, we might stumble upon the opening to the cave, right? We don't know. And so that is a really important point.
You know, Nelly, what's really also important is the archivist and the role of the archivist. And, you know, that is why it's important that we begin to diversify the archival profession.
Exactly.
Because there is an institutional knowledge that humanists, social scientists, perhaps even peer scientists can bring to a collection and provide that what's called metadata.
Exactly.
Because the metadata is what allows people to then search remotely for these collections. You know, you asked a question about President Obama. President Obama, he's not going to have a presidential library like all the other presidential presidents. What he is going to have is a museum in Chicago. By law, National Archives has to maintain and keep some of his presidential records. So the idea is to digitize the bulk of his papers that has to be kept, as well as his personal. Now, there are some integrity issues with that, but what's real important is having someone who is familiar with and has the institutional knowledge with that metadata, so that scholars and researchers can get access to that material.
Okay, so I want to just quickly move to Lewis. Thank you so much, William, for that. I just want to quickly move to Lewis. If you can just give us some thoughts on that, and then maybe swing back to her for some closing words, and then we'll take questions. I mean, we can go on and on. There's so much exciting ideas to explore.
I'll just do this briefly. Actually, last week, I went to the 30th anniversary celebration of an American Cultures requirement that was instituted at UC Berkeley, where I taught for 25 years before Santa Cruz. That actually was after pressure for a Black Studies and Ethnic Studies department. It was a requirement across I think it was the only UC, that all graduating undergrads had to take a class in different disciplines that had a variety of both experiences and covered a variety of histories of people that are, quote, minorities. So I developed a class called Picturing Identity, which was the first kind of visual representational class. And it really was about, well, it was a combination of things. It was using the example of how mostly artists of color and writers and different people had constructed the notion of identity. And we used that, so they studied that, and then they used that as a guide to sort of construct their own identity. And it was interesting that in a visual class, subjects that sometimes were the cause of conflict actually ended up being, people felt more open because everybody was making images. It was interesting. It became some cases, a safe environment for that to happen. And I think what happened was it made a lot of people think about the notion of archiving or collecting personal stories, and also seeing how that's happened in history. And that was actually, that's a class that got me tenure at Santa Cruz. And so I was happy to both introduce it at Berkeley, but also have used versions of that. And I'm sure it directly ties to my own research in terms of gathering evidence of the past as expressed visually in a variety of different ways. So that's kind of how I've used it in my teaching.
Thank you. Oh my God, thank you. So quickly, I want to turn it over to Herb. Herb, I want to give you 3 asks. We have 3 minutes. 3 things you want and a wish list, and maybe it can happen for this archive or for anything else. And we put it down. It'll be recorded for posterity here.
But it's been a learning experience, obviously being with William and Lewis and with you, Nelly. I mean, I've learned so much this afternoon, evening. And one of the things that I would stress, and I think it's ongoing, is the connection of archives. And that's being done more and more as we move into the digital age, where you can have something like history makers. That's a very important collection there. And they've moved some more than 3,000 interviews that Juliana Richardson has done there. And now they're digitized because she hooked up with the Mellon Foundation, get the money and what have you. I think here in Harlem, for example, beyond just the Harlem Archive Storytelling, and you're talking about the Harlem Gallery, that Glenn Hunter and Ken Sargent with the work they're doing there, hooking it up with the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce, which again is a tremendous resource of materials there that have not been, in a sense, archived. It's there, it's collected. What do you want to do with it? I think of posters, Lewis. I mean, the posters they have there, the whole history of like Harlem Week. I mean, the posters alone would be constitute a very, very important and significant work in understanding the history of Harlem. And we still got to get that book together, William, on the whole history of this community. I think some of the work that Kevin Magruder has done is tremendous on Philip Payton and the real estate, some of the housing stuff that you've done. All of that has to be kind of compiled. We have to bring it together, see a conflation of these materials and make it available to a wider audience, because Harlem is Harlem of the world. And I think we're gonna have to make that happen in so many different ways. I mean, the cinematography that's going on, the photography. I mean, we've got a tremendous number of filmmakers. We have to find ways that documents, the documentaries. We got to put these documentaries together in terms of what's happening in the various institutions. We talk about the Amsterdam News, you know, that's the stories there that I do each week for the last 30 some odd years. My purpose in the classroom column there is pretty much what Lewis is talking about in terms of finding these individuals who are unheralded. You've never heard of them before. Somebody say, Herb, you have to take all those things you put together. Well, that'll be like 3,000 individuals. I don't know if we can get that under one cover, but certainly that's the kind of information that is so valuable in terms of African and African-American studies. And that's where we go. We use that material in the classroom. We pass it on to those students. We hope the students take it home to those family members who didn't have the opportunities like they're having, and to share that information. And I think the digital world we're living is really processing and expanding that whole notion of a shared information, a shared history.
I love that. I love that as a final image, is sort of a connective thread, right? Like one sort of umbilical cord that connects all these different archives somehow, because I think that's one of the biggest issues is access. So I really want to open it up to questions. This is, I mean, it's never enough time. We can go on and on. So this is an opportunity for anyone. And I think am I curating these questions, or what's my role here?
Well, so I think what we'll do is thank you, everyone. That was brilliant. Thank you, Nelly and Herb and William and Lewis. Beautiful, beautiful beginnings of a conversation. I feel like there's so much more we can dive into. I just want to mention 2 things that I forgot in my opening, which is that we are going to have a section on the website called Rescue Stories. And we're going to carry on an extended, or maybe I did mention it, sorry if I'm repeating it, extended conversation with Nelly with William, with Herb, and with Lewis. So this isn't the end of it. This is just like the teaser, the trailer to dive into all this incredible information and inspiration that the four of you have provided us. Nelly, we have a request for you to put that text into the chat, if you could, or say it again, the one that
the C4, I actually had sent it time. I actually put it in the chat ahead of time.
Oh, okay.
So let me put it to the general. Yeah, it's the radical empathy in the archives.
Great.
Ooh,
And I do see
it's
questions,
there.
but I'm going to turn it over. Sydney is monitoring the chat. I see two people, Mariposa and Carla, with questions. So Nelly, you take it away. You run this section, and Sydney can also ask.
I'm sorry, I'm going to pick Mariposa. Hello, Mariposa. Go for it.
She's my top pick too, Nelly. Mariposa, can you please unmute yourself? We don't hear.
Sorry. My question is twofold. One is, Nelly, I'm interested in if you're preserving or what you're doing to, even though we're gonna be around, God is willing, for a long time, but you're a writer also, and I'm asking this because I'm in the process of working on gathering a lot of things that I've collected. My family thinks that, I was accused of being a hoarder. I beg your pardon, but this is not junk. Nelly and I, a long time ago, won a fellowship for artists under the age of 30, for writers under the age of 30. It was called the Van Leer Fellowship. And I wish I had started collecting papers at that time. But I have flyers and photographs from a poetry series that I hosted and I organized in the late 90s, early 2000s, called Café Largo, Soul in the Heights, that I would love to work on with my students at City College, because I teach in the Black Studies program. And with them, put together an archive that could hopefully be a part of this project. And my question is around, are there possibilities or opportunities for faculty to also be trained along with their students to create that type of collaboration?
That's a great question, Mariposa, who is a poet, an amazing poet. And I really appreciate the question, because I think all of us, I'm imagining Herb and Lewis. I'm sure you have back problems, right? I'm always carrying crap around between Massachusetts and New York. My parents' house, I had to move stuff out, and I'm to the point, and then I had the nerve to download, like my audiobook download is called the Afro Minimalist. I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know how I'm going to do Afro minimalism with an archive on my back, right? I think everything is an archive. I think our bodies are archives. I think DNA is an archive. And it's like, Nelly, at what point, like, what do we do with all this? So that's why I'm very interested in how do we transform, as William was saying, repurpose archives so that they're not static things that we lug around, right? How can we make archives part of the architecture? I want to make a garden of books. Like I want to reimagine the library. I don't want to always go into a building, right? And can I, Mariposa, pose that question to my fellow panelists, because I don't have that answer. I think we should teach our archives and release them and not hoard them, because it's a fire hazard and our backs will get wrecked. So yeah, can we get some answers here? Because I don't have it.
Well, one of the things here, Nelly, is your computer, your laptop, your cell phone, those are like archives of material. I mean, I have like an external hard drive. I have 2 external hard drives. So the gigabytes, are forever. And so that's a warehouse of information right there. And I go back from time to time and kind of cannibalize, some of the stuff, fossilized stuff that I have, and kind of reassert it, put it right on back out there again, revisit it, revise it, refine it, some cases correct it. So all of that material that you do on your computer, don't lose that, because that, as a journalist, I write every day. In fact, and I'm glad I got into journalism, because it develops a discipline. For other writers, they struggle with it, talk about writer's block. I'm working on this novel and whatever. It's a more challenging situation. With a journalist, we always faced with tomorrow's deadline. And you got to deal with that. So in compiling that information, you got it all available there. And particularly if you're doing a column, each week you got a column. And after you've been doing that column for 50 years, well, that's a book right there, if you choose to go back and stitch that stuff together. So don't lose sight of that computer and wherever you're collecting, how you process your information. That's the beginning of it. That's a collection there. And if you want to take that and download it or duplicate it and share it with others, I do a lot of that. I send it off to some people who have their own archives. There's 3 or 4 writers out there that keep up with me and it's hitting me every time I do something. They're right on top of it. Sometimes I say, well, it may come a point where I might have to call on them to give me back some of the stuff I put out that I do not have, that was not collected. So the writer's responsibility as a historian, is to make sure you begin to document, all the stuff that you do, because that's important. Sometimes, the archivists don't realize the kind of archiving he or she is doing.
I want to inject a cautionary tale, though. All of those hard drives will crash and die. And it's really important to back up multiple times and also back up in the cloud. I can tell you, I've lost 2 years worth of digital material not doing that. So I'm telling you that the nice thing about the computer is right in your hand, you have access to the museum or the library in Alexandria, Egypt, but you can also lose all that stuff in a fraction, and you will. So it's actually really important to back it up. Someone asked a question about documenting fragile family histories. I would say flatbed scanner usually is pretty good, although in some cases, if you don't want to press glass on it or anything, you can photograph it or bring it to someone that can reproduce it. I think that it's really important that to protect the originals, it's important that they are reproduced, and you have a variety of ways to do that. So that was what I was going to say.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I don't know if William has any insights as someone who actually handles, right, physically, a lot of these materials.
Well, as a purist, I believe in maintaining the original documents and selectively digitizing materials. One of the most fragile and delicate collections is the audiovisual. So
tell us about the James Baldwin clip. I think the video clip, right? 1980s, Langston Hughes Festival.
So at City College, there is the Langston Hughes Festival. And James Raymond started it back in the late 70s. And the first recipient of the Langston Hughes Festival Medal was James Baldwin. He just got off the plane from France, flew in, left the airport, came to City College and gave a speech, an acceptance speech of the award. Fast forward almost 25, 30 years ago, the interview, which was filmed on reel to reel, sat in a room, and vinegar syndrome began to deteriorate his acceptance speech. Now understand, that thing was not out there amongst the public. It was not on YouTube. It was not anywhere. And so if we lose that, then we lose one of James Baldwin's public engagements.
So dissemination is important too, disseminate in different sources.
Yes.
I do want to get to Carla Cherry, so just know, Carla, that I have you in mind. I'm sorry, Will.
No,
I'm trying to be a good moderator.
Carla's got something good to say, so let Carla say. I just want to say, to the credit of my colleague at City College who rescued the tape is, how does a name slip me? Go ahead, Carla, the name will come back to me in a minute. He's gonna kill me. Go ahead, Carla.
All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Carla Cherry. I'm in the MFA in Creative Writing program. I'm in Professor Gibbons' class. And I wanted to know what the panel think about like artistic license in history. I recently saw the movie, The Harder They Fall. I don't know how many of you have seen that movie, but let me just say that the writers took a lot of liberties with the lives of people like Stagecoach Mary and various Black cowboys, you know, in the 1800s. And so I wanted to know how you all feel about like artistic license and to what extent writers should kind of change the details of people's lives.
Carla, I think that's an excellent question. And this is why I went into the idea of the effective roles that we have responsibility to, right, as creatives. So this is where you would have to have empathy for the subject of the archival record. If you had empathy, you would think about the subject, right? You would not maybe, you would not privilege, say, the archivist or maybe the, you know, you would really think about the sensitivity of the subject and what the values are there. And this is where the radical empathy piece comes in, right? What levels of empathy are we deploying as creatives when we do engage in archive? So I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on that, Herb or Lewis or William.
Well, one of the things I can say about the film is that it's total fiction. It's almost like the Miami situation with Muhammad Ali, Malcolm, Sam Cooke, never really occurred. And you have the writers, and you have this creativity that comes into play. You don't mind that sometimes if it's harmless, and it doesn't, you know, the character, that individual is not defamed. The integrity is maintained. And I think if William Loren Katz was alive, who did Black cowboys and Black Indians, I think he would be totally upset in seeing that film because it did some things to individuals like Deadwood Dick and Nat Love, to Stagecoach Mary Fields, that was not true at all. And they were put in some ridiculous situations and in rivalries too, you know, competing against each other. They never did that. So a lot of young people coming along, you know, the idea in terms of being an archivist, a historian is digging there to find the real facts of those individuals' lives. And you can see the disparity.
I was going to say that is interesting about art and the interpretation that was a couple of things. That there have been a number of oral histories for my book about the Fillmore District, Harlem of the West, and people we talked about too, over periods of time, the stories change. And so on the level that idea of truth is always a kind of moving target. On the other hand, I'm thinking about the movie about Jimi Hendrix, and someone invented that he was abusive to his girlfriends, which was not absolutely not true. And I guess as a way to make the movie, I guess they thought it would make it more appealing to an audience or something. And I think there's always that danger. Well, you have to really take artistic expression with a grain of salt, because there's always a reason. There's either the idea of recall not being accurate, or someone having other artistic license, which is both a good and dangerous thing.
Let's take the question from Justin Joyce.
Hi, yeah, thank you. This has been really fascinating. I'm super excited to hear from you all. I had a question that sort of, it really resonated, William, when you talked about being a purist with things, right? But so much of the work that we're doing these days is, I mean, for lack of a better phrase, born digital, right? So much happens via email. mean, I can tell you, this is the first time right now this evening that Herb Boyd and I think have ever seen each other. We've done a little bit of work together, right?
That's true, Justin.
Email,
Oh,
right?
that's-
And I mean, it's exciting in this way, but I guess my question is a sort of pragmatic one, right? How do we go about preserving something as sort of mundane, but as fundamental as email?
I actually think the question should be broader. It's about communication, because email is sort of one thing. And it's interesting, I haven't taught for 7 years, thank God, but I've been sitting in on virtual classes the last couple of years. And especially in art classes, on the one hand, there's these kids very frustrated because they want to have the facilities, they want to be able to use work. On the other hand, they are really thirsting for any information they can get because they're sort of existing in this void. So it's a two-sided coin. And I think it really has to do with, I guess, taking advantage of the means we have to communicate with each other, and not to rely or to make sort of think that one is sort of perfect, because none of them are perfect, including a conversation face to face in many cases. I guess that's what I would say.
And this is why I do think, I always talk about biodiversity, diversity, period, because I think we do need to disseminate the ways in which we preserve. I don't like the idea that Google Drive has half my brain. You know, I don't like that these corporations in many ways are paywalls behind some of these, you know, drives and clouds. So I think it's really important to have sort of analog versions, digital versions. You know, nature knows this, right? Like a diversity of forms and formats, spoken, you know, on YouTube, on tapes, you know, email yourself stuff, print things out, you know, in whatever capacity you can. I mean, I know that for Watts, I mean, I'm imagining, you know, you're dealing with digital images, which take up a lot of space.
Mm-hmm.
And then even how do you categorize them so you can easily find any given version of an image? What
Not
is
to
the
mention
metadata?
40 years worth of film.
Oh my God,
So,
it is a nightmare.
I mean, it's interesting to sort of have that access and have the ability to convert one or the other, but it really is. But I think that idea of it's just not safe to rely on one means, because none of them are going to last. You could lose control of some of them, and some of them just die. So I think it's important to sort of not have everything in one room, for that matter, physically.
And go to your grandmother's house, leave something in the closet.
Absolutely, yes. No, that is really true. So
seriously, my parents, they have like my brother's comic book collection.
And you know your grandmother will take care of it too. So
they will.
Nelly, one of the things I like to add, and I don't think Justin has been very modest in his presentation, because what he and Douglas Field and Dwight McBride and Quentin Miller, a number of other Baldwin scholars have been doing over the years is put together the James Baldwin Review. Mm-hmm. That is an archive right there of materials on James Baldwin. Beyond Raoul Peck and I Am Not Your Negro, beyond the documentary, The Price of the Ticket and what have you, you got an ongoing collection here of essays that are coming in all the time. And Justin, you should speak to that. Don't let this moment pass, because the work you're doing there with the James Baldwin Review, obviously I'm waving my own flag because I sit on the advisory board there. But I just finished doing a long article on the James Baldwin Symposium at Virginia State University. And there you had like, the old dyed-in-the-wool scholars on James Baldwin were not necessarily there, but it had like a collection, a coterie of these aspiring Baldwin scholars. It was so interesting to hear what they had to say. So it's a generational thing, how one generation tussles with information about such iconic individuals, such a literary giant as James Baldwin. How does he begin to impact, as we talked about Malcolm X, from one generation to another, their apprehension, their appreciation, their analysis, that dissection of that particular individual and their production, the legacies that they've left behind. Justin?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the shout out, Herb. Thank you. But yeah, I mean, that's very obvious. That's what I'm asking about. That's what I'm concerned about, right? So I mean, this journal project has been going on for, I mean, we're in volume 7, but it's more than 10 years to make it happen. And I mean, I have a couple letters, very few, and there are, you know, there are physical books and there is a website, but so much of it is, quite frankly, just on my emails, right? I'm the managing editor for the journal, and so I do a lot of the solicitation, a lot of the negotiations and all of that. And I mean, with all due humility, I'd like to think that at some point this would be an archive people would want to look at. But the computer that I'm quite literally looking at and talking to you right now, and the backup hard drive sitting on the other side of my desk, if those two go away, it's gone. And it's really not practical to print it all out.
Well, this is where the
And I've
creativity
also, I mean,
comes
this has
in.
been through 3 different universities, right? I've moved around, and so the emails are at some universities, and I do my best to keep track of them and try to save them, right? But by the time this archive, I mean, by the time we just even get to volume 10 for the journal, yeah, I mean, that's right. That is my concern.
Justin, let me just add a couple of things, and I commend you, and I appreciate the work that you've been doing. Some of those emails have highly archival evidential value, and that's how you begin to determine what you selectively might want to print out versus not print out. And so some of that correspondence is really important. So you may want to consider printing some of it out, if not all of it. But one of the things that you can do, the most stable medium, the 2 most stable mediums we have, believe it or not, is microfilm and DVDs and CD-ROMs. With those,
Microfiche too.
Yeah, microfiche, yes. So what you can do with the CD-ROMs and the DVDs is back them up multiple times on archival gold DVDs and CDs. So you could take all of your emails, because if you preserve and create multiple copies of DVDs of your emails and put them in cases, they can last a long time, especially if you continually back them up, because some of us have DVDs and CDs from 30, 40 years ago. So that is a way, because if you use a flash drive or a hard drive, that can crash. But a DVD or CD, you can put a lot of information on there and back them up and have multiple versions of it, so that it is secure.
I do want to ask too, because I think it's worth asking what the rubric of this is for all of us, right? And what we choose to save and not save, because there can be a bit of a fetishizing of information. And then the question is why? Like, why is this communication important, right? And this is where we get into, you know, how does it impact the present? Are we getting, you know, sort of like, are we drowning in our past and obsessed with, you know, leaving breadcrumbs? Like, we're gonna just drown in breadcrumbs. So I think that's my larger question too, as preservers, as creators, as users, as archivists and communities. What is the point of having an archive if it's not doing anything for us in the present and for the future? So these are just larger questions. Yeah, and that's yeah. So is it Lewis, you wanted to say
I was just going to say, the best way to find out you're going to miss something is to delete it. I mean, it's what happens is, as soon as you delete something,
no.
I'm telling you, and it's weird, it is so weird, and it is true that some of this stuff, it is like the breadcrumbs is a really good analogy. On the other hand, that's how Hansel and Gretel found their way back. You have to.
But what if there's a lot of breadcrumbs and you're drowning in like carbs?
Well,
like,
true.
how are you gonna?
Yeah, and it is true. I think what's nice about the kind of digital means of storage, even though it's not stable, is that's probably easier to transfer than even printing things out or wherever else you're going to do it, or like copying it. It is. I mean, it really is an issue, but the sort of history, the digital history that exists now is under some threat because almost all the means of storage is not stable. I mean, it really is interesting that's so. You know, I don't know what to tell you about that. I guess at some point you make a decision about the multiple copies you have, what you get rid of, and maybe you don't copy it. I think you can. You'll go crazy, but you just need to know if it's gone, it's gone. So I guess that's what.
It's like the terror of like cultural Alzheimer's. Like what, you know, I really think in many ways we are bound by our history, and in a way it's liberating, but also is it? I mean, this is what I always ask myself as someone who's obsessed with archives.
So Nelly, ask yourself this question, right? I mentioned archival evidential value, but here's something, and Herb will like this. What is past is prologue.
Prologue.
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
So, you know, the past helps inform us about the present and the future.
Mm-hmm.
So establishing a criteria
Mm-hmm.
for what has archival evidential value
Mm-hmm.
and train ourselves on that. and then be able to, you know, Malcolm's diary has been put on microfilm because they know that medium and microfiche will be stable for years to come.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we have to begin to do is, I mean, we have all the technology capabilities, and so we have to figure out a way to put that in a stable environment.
Talk about stable environment.
I have no idea why my son is in here. My son just dropped a chair, almost hit me with it. But the other thing is, very quickly, is we have to, as consumers, I mean, Nelly, you mentioned it, we have to get back control of our information.
Absolutely, yes.
And we can say a word in our phones and begin to see stuff appear.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many firewalls. And so we have to figure out how we can preserve our stuff, our privacy,
Mm-hmm.
and maintain those things that have archival evidential value. So I think that's what we need to really focus on, is because everything is through digitally, email, social media, and everything is out there.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to figure out how to get that control, because we're losing control
Right.
of our information,
Right.
of our privacy. We're losing control of that. And
So we have one more minute, and I want to turn it over to Herb. Herb, can you please give us some fire to walk away with?
Really?
May you set us aflame.
I think the gang here has just been absolutely on fire. And let's find a way to fan the flames, you know, find a way to—
Without burning down the archives.
Yeah, you're right. Don't burn the archives down, though. No, the thing about it is that this is information communication. And this is your process. Obviously, this is being documented. This is being recorded, and it should be shared. Because there's a whole lot of people. I think what we had 40, 50 people showed up for the event. Then they can pass the word. They can have copies of this and share it. Because this whole archival thing is a shared endeavor. You know, it's like these community of thinkers coming together, connection of libraries, whether it's in Alexandria or in San Francisco. You know, you bring in all these ideas together under separate covers. It could be film, it could be microfilm, microfiche, it could be the books. And I love the fact that I do most of my stuff in terms of longevity is in the books. However, the documentaries are around and they're coming almost on a weekly basis. Individuals we're discovering that we never heard of before. That's information, and having those students, those young people come into the classroom, they have to walk in and walk out inspired. Otherwise, what we're talking about now, you know, will be Lewis deleted.
And what a blessing that it exists in this program at CCA. That's a different institution, CCNY, really. Thank you, Michelle and everybody.
Thank you so much, all of you.
Michelle.
And
Nelly.
Yes, thank you. And may we keep plowing forward.
All right.
By the way, the Alexandria Library was supposedly burned down 7 times, and it was in the myth, and here we are, and it's digital. Apparently there's a digital, we do go to that digital space. So let's keep it moving.
All right.
Thank
And
you
San
so
Francisco
much.
has not burned down yet.
No.
Thank you, Nelly, for moderating a beautiful discussion. You can tell how fascinating it was because not very many people left. I want to give a shout out to many, to everyone who attended. Thank you so much. I can see that there are friends, alum, writers, poets, our esteemed faculty. It's just wonderful. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you very much, everyone. And have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. And I do want to just reiterate what everyone said. Everything that we do as part of this archives project is completely accessible to the public. It's free. All the programs and conversations will be uploaded onto the website. And you can, if you missed it or if you think your friends will be interested, please pass it along and join our mailing list. Thanks so much, everyone, and good night.
Thank you, Michelle.
Bye, New York.
Adios.
Adios. Hey.
Thank you.
Off to my next event. I got to get out of here.
Bye, Herb.
Me too.
Okay.